So before actually starting with Android's back, I will just ask some questions like how many of you are using Android devices? Nice. And how many of you are using back gesture instead of the back button? And how many of actually you know that you can actually change the back gestures to the navigation mode or any other thing? Okay, good. So for the first 4 versions of Android, if you are like developing since version 1, most of the time if you want to intercept the Android's back button, so like when your user is pressing back button and you want to show some sort of custom dialogues or you want to do something, this is basically the method which is we need to as a developers to override, which is called onKeyDown. And after first 4 versions, Android team figured out or found that most of the developers or on the Android forums, most of the developers, they are asking about question of intercepting back button. So they come up with the new solution which is introduced in Android Clear onBackPressed. So if you are Android developer, it's there since Android Clear, and it was there all the way to the Android Q. So within Q is basically the Android 10, and they introduced gesture-based navigation in here. And if you want to learn more about this, you can go through this small video by the Android developer relations team. They explained like how gesture navigation works or how you actually move from back button-based navigation to the gesture-based navigation. So as I asked you, like if you don't know, like there is an option in the settings in your device. So you go to the system settings, and then there is an option called navigation mode. And then there are 3 options that you can select. For example, gesture navigation, then there is 2 button, and then there is a 3 button navigation. So for Samsung devices, I'm using S21, I guess, when it was launched, and I bought it. And for a couple of months, I don't know that we can actually customize the gesture-based navigation. So by default, the Samsung devices, they have 3 button navigation. So if you want to see the predictive back animation like in action, you need to actually turn on the gesture navigation on your devices. And in Android 13, probably last year, they marked the onBackPressed API as a deprecated. So if you are in your code bases, you are having targeted SDKs set for your applications to 13 or 14, which is not stable yet, you will see the lint warnings everywhere if you have onBackPressed methods in your activities or anywhere you want to, like you are doing some custom stuff. So you can see some sort of like lint warning there that this method is deprecated, and solution is like move to the new APIs which are introduced in Android 13. They are called onBackPressed dispatcher. So in Android 13, why they mark these APIs as a deprecated, the main reasoning behind is like to providing the better UX for the end users. So as Lauren said, like when user performing some like the back gestures in their like in any application, so they can see like where they're actually going to be after performing that action. Sometimes applications intercepting the back navigation, and they can see like, for example, they're showing some custom dialogues or they just kill their applications, so that users, like if they have some unsaved information in there, it might be lost, and they don't know if there is no any like a preview kind of thing. So that was the main reasoning behind actually to mark these APIs deprecated and providing better solution for the providing better UX for the end users. So at last Google I/O, this concept is called ahead of time model. So basically that users can see ahead of time when they're actually performing the back action, so they can actually decide if they really want to perform it or if they want to cancel the back gesture as they are performing the back gesture in Android applications. So this is really detailed video about, mostly I can say about the developers. If you want to support ahead of time or predictive back gestures in your application, you can see this video, and this is basically for Android 13. So if you are not Android developer, you can skip these parts, but this is some sort of like internal implementations of Android's predictive back gesture. So like onBackPressed dispatcher, how it internally works. So this is the class called nativepreinput stage. So here is a link. I will share the slides. You can check by yourself. So when you like open that link, it is basically Android code search where you can see all the code for the Android framework. So this is the first method when you provide any input to any like keyboard input or whatever input to your device. This is handling all those events. And if you see the code with the if statement, it says like if this is a back event, like user tap on the back button or the predictive performing back gesture, and it's check basically for on back invoked callback. So if there is any callbacks, I will explain how callbacks work. So this is basically for, this code is basically for Android 13 or higher versions. So if it's back gesture, it will be handled in here. So it will not go to the Android activities or like your backpress methods anymore. It will be handled at the Windows level. So each activity, each fragment or dialogues, they have their windows. So if you are performing, like if you are supporting the back gesture, it will be handled like this. So you can understand more like how this works. So if you say here, it returns the finish handled. So basically it's informing the system or the other stages of the framework that this particular event is handled, so that it will move forward with other events if there is any. So right now the onBackPress method, basically if you see the component activity in your Android framework, it's basically one line code, and it basically calling the backpress dispatcher, which is internal for that activity. And the definition of backpress dispatcher is here. So if you see here, it takes the runnable, like the default, it's basically the fallback. So if there is no any callback present for that backpress dispatcher, it will just call the parents on backpress. So if you see this line, sorry for the formatting. So component activity dot super. So basically it's calling the like our base activities on backpress, which is just default, which is like killing the application or going back to the home. And next thing is, this is the main API, so onBackPress dispatcher. So instead of using the onBackPress method anymore, we need to use the onBackPress dispatcher. It's available via activities or dialogues, or there are some other components. For example, if you want to implement your own, you can do so. So this is the code for onBackPress method of this new API. So it will basically go through all the callbacks. If you see here, it takes the descending iterator. So basically when we are adding callbacks, it's basically a stack, so last in, first out. And sometimes it's true, but the thing is, if you see, the trick is here is like, this is again the internal implementation of the backpressed. So it checks like if there is any enabled callbacks. So as a developers, we can set the enabled state of particular given callback true or false. By default is like it's enabled. So if there is any enabled callback present, it will take that callback and execute that and return from there. Otherwise, if there is no any callback present, it will execute the fallback. If you see the previous slide, it takes the runnable. That runnable will be executed if there is no any callback presented and user pressed the back gesture or like the back press button. So that was like the overview of onBackPress dispatcher API. Now I will show you like how we can use this API in different components in our Android application, for example, in activities or dialogues. So there are a couple of ways actually to adding the callback to the dispatcher. So this code is Kotlin. So the first line says onBackPress dispatcher.add callback. So that's basically the getter on onBackPress dispatcher. So each activity has access to the onBackPress dispatcher, or I can say it has property called onBackPress dispatcher that we can use to add callbacks. So if you want to do some custom work for like when your user tapping on the back or performing back gesture, you need to provide the callbacks and do your work there. And it takes like a onBackPress callback, which has until Android 13 there is only single method which is called handle onBackPressed. So this is basically your code for onBackPressed, which was deprecated. So you need to move everything to this new API to make your applications work with predictive back gesture. Again, this is the internal implementation. You can skip for the moment. I will explain you later how this basically works. And this add callback method, it takes 2 parameters. And there are other different versions, like you can skip the first, which is basically the lifecycle owner. So if you are an Android developer, you might know there are different life cycles for each component. For example, activity has its own life cycle, and dialogues have its own, then fragments have their own. So when you are adding callbacks, if you are defining the lifecycle owner, then you don't need to worry about removing those callbacks or enable or setting the disable state of those callbacks. So whenever that lifecycle state is in the expected state, for example, it's resumed or started, this callback will automatically get enabled, so that when user performed back gesture, this particular callback will be executed. Otherwise, like when the lifecycle owner is going to be in stop state, then this callback will be automatically get disabled. So this one is in the dialogues. For example, if you have implemented any dialogues and you want to intercept the back press in there, so if in that case it will be same, like you have access to the onBackPressed dispatcher, you can add the callback. Like this is the version where I'm omitting the it's basically the same way, but we can pass the lambdas when there is a single interface method, like the single interfaces with single function. So I'm just providing the code that's going to be executed on handle onBackPress, which is basically dismiss this dialog and then remove this callback. And for the fragments, there is no direct access to the onBackPress because every fragment is going to be part of activities. So in case of activities, like you can define your backpress callbacks in your fragments, but if you want to perform custom stuff, then you need to access its activities backpress dispatcher. So the last line is basically for that. So you define the backpress dispatcher, like the callback. You add that callback to the activities backpress dispatcher here, and this is the best practices when you are doing for like adding callbacks in your fragments, that you should provide the view, like the lifecycle owner as a view lifecycle owner, because fragments and their views have their own lifecycle owners. So when your views get destroyed, then this callback will automatically get disabled, so that it will be goes to the next one which is available for the given backpress dispatcher. So that was like the old way of, or I cannot say the old way of doing things, but if you are heavily developing your applications or you are writing using composables like the Jetpack Compose, in that case there is a composable available for us. So if you want to handle backpress in your compose functions, the function is called backhandler. It takes the state which is enabled, false or true, whatever you want, and then you provide the code whatever you want to do. So in this case, the lambda will be added to the local onBackPress dispatcher owner. So every, like if it's basically local context provider, the closest context will be getting these callbacks. These callbacks will be added to the closest activity, like where your composable is defined. And you can learn more about backhandler on this link. So there are a couple of methods that are available for the callbacks. So first is like if you don't want to remove or enable like a state at different places in your code base, you can just emit the first method, which is like removing the callback, or setting the last one is like enable or disable the state of callback. So if you want to do that, you just need to define your callback and have a reference to that. So in that case, you can just define your callback, and then later on, if you want to enable or disable based on certain conditions, you can have a reference and then call your methods. For example, remove that callback or set its state to true or false. And the last one is like if you want to check if there is any enabled callbacks available or not on the given backpress dispatcher. So that was like the overview of backpress dispatcher and how we can use that, initializing it, adding callbacks, setting their states. The main important part is here is migration. So if you are targeting Android 13, in that case, since it was like almost a year, but there are not a lot of applications that are actually providing support for predictive back gesture, and there might be a various reasons, but the major, like the common one, is like most of the applications, they are doing some sort of hacks on their backpress dispatchers, like they are for the analytics purposes, or maybe like I don't know, like there is only, I guess, Reddit, which is right now providing support for this. And if you want to actually see this in action, you need to set it in the developers options. So if you are not a developer, you need to learn how to enable the developer mode in your phones, and then set the predictive back animations switch to on. So then you can see actually how it works. And if you set that, then most of the financial applications gonna not work, because they will feel that your phone is not secured and somebody is trying to steal your information or stuff like that. So it's kind of a showstopper. But starting with Android 14, this will gonna be enabled as a default. So you don't need to play those kind of tricks to get it working. So it will be by default on, and if there is any applications that are providing the support for predictive back gesture, you will actually see the cool animations when you are switching between activities or fragments, or even when you are performing when your application is going back to the home screen. So for the developers, there are a couple of options when it comes to the migration. The option one is, which is not the case for the most of the developers. So just if you are not intercepting backpress in your applications or fragments or wherever, then you just need to set the tag on your application tag in the manifest file, which is called enable on back invoked callback. Set it to true, and you are good to go. And what does that basically do is, like in your activity class, it will basically, this is the code which actually tells to the system like, hey, the system predictive back gesture support is on for this application, and do this cool stuff. So it will just check the flag ahead of time back. This is just a Boolean flag that is checking against that property if that is true or false. And this is only until Android 13. And if it's that, then it will just initialize the default callback, which is calling the navigation back method from the activity, which is the default implementation of the back. And then it will add callback to the systems. If you see here, it says like register system back callback, and this is like the internal function that we cannot use, but activity class internally using this to adding the callback to the predictive new API. So option 2 is like when you are having custom back code in your applications. For example, if you are intercepting back in your code, like if you have forms or there is some information that you want to make sure that you just show some sort of dialogues to your end users, like, hey, you're going to lose this information if you just perform back or something like that, and you want to make sure that you save that information. In that case, if there is a custom back code and your application is using Android X, so if you don't know Android X, mostly I guess everybody who is developing for Android, they are using Android X. This is basically the set of libraries that are helping developers to build more powerful and better applications, like for providing support for older versions as well as for the latest versions. So if you are using Android X and you are using custom backcode, the solution is onBackPressed dispatcher API. This is basically an API which works all the way back to the version 21, like Android version 21, and which covers almost 90% of the devices in the market. So you don't just want to support like Android 13 or higher. So again, if you are using Android X, you can use this API, and it has a couple of advantages. Like the first one, as I already told you, like it's back compatible, API greater than equals like 21, and then it's single source of truth. So you don't need to check in your code base like, hey, if the version is 21 or 13 or 14, then do this. You just provide a single implementation, and it works on all the Android versions. So option 3 is like if you have custom backcode and you are not using Android X, which is like I'm not sure like if there is any Android applications that are not using Android X, but if you are like in that category, then you have to use the onBack invoked dispatcher API. This is like a platform API which is introduced in Android 13. So in this case, it just works for API 13 or higher. So you are kind of restricted. Your user, like they can only see the predictive back gesture for versions that are 13 or higher, and that's not a huge number of devices in the market that are actually on Android 13 right now. So, and the second option is like the second major drawback I can say is like need to manage the back functionality in multiple places. So you need to perform some sort of like checks in your code base. For example, like if the version is 13 or higher, then you're gonna use this API. Otherwise, you have that old code like onBackPressed button, like the thing that I mentioned earlier, like which is deprecated. So you're gonna use that one for versions that are older than 13, and then for the higher versions like 13 or higher, you're gonna use this API. So this is the sample code for the. If you want to use the platform API, the first step is like basically you are checking like if version is at least T, which is Android 13. So you make sure that this code is going to be executed only when your app is running on 13 or higher. So you're going to define your callback. The second step is like you need to register your callback so that it will be invoked when user perform the callback. It will take two parameters. The first one is priority, and the second is callback. So there are a couple of options for the priority, which is default or overlay. So default is for activities or fragments there, and the overlays for example, for dialogues or drawers that are like show on top of the activities or the fragment windows. And overlay is having a higher priority than default because they are on top of the activities windows, so that they will intercept the back before it actually goes to the activities or other components of your application. And then the last one is just if you want to unregister that callback at some point, you just, for example, here I'm observing some sort of flow like flows here, like if that back callback flag is true or not, then based on that value, I'm just unregistering the callback that I just defined earlier. So that was all about until Android 13, and starting with Android 14 beta 2, they come up with like a lot of more features in Android, like predictive back gesture. So until Android 13, it will only provide a predictive back gesture animation when you are moving to the home screen. So you will only see that single animation if you are supporting predictive back gesture. But if you are targeting 14 and you are supporting the back gestures, it will provide a lot of more animation support, for example, from activity to activity. So I will explain that, and then I will show you some demos at the end. So the first one is enabling the gestures at activity level. So when they enable, like when they introduced this new API in Android 13, it was like, if you remember from the previous slides, like you need to add that flag in your application tag, and it will be enabled for everything for your application. But that is quite challenging. For example, if you have like 10 activities and you only want to support this for 4 activities or 2 activities, whatever, that's not going to be like a solution, or that's not going to work with the previous solution which was introduced in 13. So in Android 14, they come up with the solution which looks like this. You set it to false. You set it to false at the app level, and then you set it to true whichever activity you want to handle the back gesture, or you want to basically set it to true, and then system knows that you are not going to providing a support for back gesture when you're for your main activity, but you are actually providing support for the second activity. So you can actually have a partial support for the predictive back gesture in your applications, starting with 14. The next one is cross-activity transitions. So if you are having custom transitions, most of the time you, as an end user, you might see like the custom animations, like when you go from one screen to second screen, it goes left, right, or top, bottom kind of animations. So the existing API, as a developer, you might know that it's called override pending transitions to provide a support for custom transitions, and you define these 3 components in there. But if you want to support predictive back gesture and you also want to use custom activity transitions, there are new APIs introduced in version 1.8.0 alpha 01 for the Android X activity API. So you need to use these 2 APIs to make sure that your custom transitions work with the predictive back gesture. So if you have implemented, let's say, left-right animation for your activities, for example, and then you just define, call these 2 methods in your own create of your activity class, and then it will work with predictive back gesture. And the next thing is the back progress. So this is really cool that now we are actually as a developers, we actually get the information when users start performing the back gesture. So we can actually see, we get the information through the back event. If you see here the parameter back event, and it provides us the information about which edge user is performing and then the progress. So that if you want to do some sort of if you want to translate any components in your activity, or you want to scale some components. For example, in here let's say I'm having compose holder, which is a view in my XML file, layout file. I want to translate that as user is performing the gesture. So I'm just using the progress, and then there is any, for example, just assume that there is a max x shift variable, and then I'm just setting the translating my the view as user is performing the back gesture. So we have actually the information where is the back gesture is going, which edge, and then how far it's actually user has performed that. And then we have another 2 methods, which is handle on back started and then back cancelled. So if user is started performing back gesture and then they cancel it, we will get the information through these 2 callbacks, when they started or when they cancelled. And again, this is also available starting with alpha 01. So the another important update from Android 14 is the Android X transition framework update. So if you are using custom animations in your applications using the Android transition framework, not Android transition, basically it's Android X transition framework, which is to provide a support for older versions or backward compatible. So in there they also provided new API if you want to perform a custom animations when user is performing the back gestures. So if you see here, I have created a transition streak controller, and as user started the back started, if you see the first method handle on back started, so we get the access to the back event, and then I'm initializing my control delayed transition. This is the new API which works with Android predictive back gesture. So if you're familiar with how transitions work, it will take parameters, for example, the root view, which has those elements that you want to animate, and then the transition. For example, here I'm using the fade transition, and then I'm just performing actions on transition manager that I have just earlier defined. So for example, on backpress, I'm checking if my transition controller is ready. So what it does is it makes sure that it's ready to perform the transition. So I'm just setting its current time milliseconds so that it will move as the user performing the back. And then on the back, when the back press is finished, which is basically handle on back pressed, so I'm setting the state to false and then moving the controller to at the end, so the animation is smoothly finished. And then if the user is cancelling the transition, I will just start again, set the begin delay transition and set my animation state to the default state. And this Android X transition framework, it's only support this new API only supports Android 14 or higher versions. And this is available with transitions version 1.5.0 alpha 1. Here is the link if you want to learn more about it. Also with the, as Jin mentioned, material design, most of the, as a developers, we are using the material design for the designing our applications. So they also provided a support for the predictive back gesture for certain components. So with version 1.10.0 alpha 3, they come up with the predictive backgesture support for few components, like the bottom sheet. Then there is a side sheet and the search view. So if you see in the demo, like this is the side sheet view. So when it's opened, if user is performing back gesture, you see that it shows that cool animation that it's going to be dismissed at some point, and then this is for like bottom sheet. So when user is performing back from any edge, it's actually like shrinking its size, that it's showing to the end user that it's going to be dismissed. So you don't need to do anything if you are using these components in your applications. You just need to bump the version of your material library to 1.10.0 and it works. So this talk I already given at the DroidCon San Francisco, and during when I am like working on this talk, I found issue with the WhatsApp. If you are using the WhatsApp, you might find this issue also. If it's still in prod, there is no fixes yet. So with Android 14, they also provided a guidance to how to actually implement back like any gestures in your applications. So for example, this is the functionality in WhatsApp, like when you want to add a status in your in WhatsApp, you can actually crop the images, and it actually conflicting with the back gesture. So if you see when I try to perform the cropping, you see the little arrow, that is basically the back button, like the back gesture. You see that arrow comes up as I'm trying to crop the image. So it's basically conflicting with that, and it's super annoying that you can't crop your images, and it just cancels the crop, like the state of the crop of your whatever you are trying to do here. So this is basically the link for that, for when if you are like having custom gestures in your application, to make sure that your gestures are not conflicting with the system gestures, and it works as expected. So there is a little demos. This is about the Android 13. To move to the home screen, it shows that animation, like when user is performing back gesture. But there is no animation. It's like when user is on the second activity, like launch second activity, the second animation. They see the, and this is the demo from Android 14. So if you see the world, the correct, like the word, it's basically fading out. That was like Android X transitions framework support for that, and this is basically the cross activities. So if you can see here, as I'm moving from between activities, you can see like I'm going to the activity from this one, and the other one is like if you want to play with the translation or scaling of certain components, you can see on the second activity when I'm performing the back gesture, it actually scaling and translating the first components. So this is some of the demos of the predictive back gesture so far. And a couple of days ago, I guess 2 or 3 days ago, in beta 3, like this is basically the last stable beta from actually publicly available for like from like the last beta for Android 14, and then next one is going to be a public release for Android 14. They provided a support for fragments. So like if you are using fragments in your application and you are using the navigation component library, or you are using animator, there is a support for predictive back gestures. So when fragment 1, let's say you have 2 fragments and you are in A to B, and then you come back from B to A, you will like your end users will see the same sort of animations when they are coming back from B to A in fragments. And here is the sample code for this. Repository is still DroidCon SF sample, so you can check there. I will update with the new fragment updates here, and you just need to code it and then run it, it will work. And here are a couple of references. First link is about the stories of hard 3 keys, like why they are actually moved from key down functions to onBackPress, and then the rest of are all about the latest and recent updates for the back press or the predictive back gesture in Android. And here we go. Thank you.